First steps into Asia. As I crossed the Hellespont and landed in Asia, I threw up my spear into the ground. I wanted everyone to know I was here to stay. Of course, the Persians thought they could do something about that, and I faced them in the first battle at the Granicus River soon after we arrived. We won, of course, but King Darius was still building his army for the battle that could decide his fate and mine. Not a problem. There was an old legend that whoever could untie an ancient knot at Gordium would rule Asia. I don't like to disappoint my people, so I said I'd give it a try. It was really difficult, but I couldn't afford to fail. In the end, I drew my sword and sliced through it. I don't know why no one had thought of it before. Darius the Coward. We seemed to be making good progress, and I couldn't figure out why Darius wasn't coming to fight. Finally, he managed to get his strongest forces together for a battle at Issus in the fall of 333 BCE. It was another big win for the Macedonians, with some added Greeks. Darius saved his own skin, but he left his family behind to fight. What a coward. The Great General. Alexander was one of the most successful generals in history. Some people say that he was lucky, but Alexander always made sure his battle plan suited the terrain, and he targeted the weaknesses of his enemy. His soldiers followed him because he was always ready to put his own life in danger in the heat of the battle. Dissing Darius. Darius offered me half of his empire to make peace with him. I told him I was taking all of it, and I'd catch up with him, too. I certainly had to fight for it. One of my toughest battles was at the siege of Tyre on the coast of Phoenicia, modern Lebanon. After many months, we stormed the island city by attacking from land and sea. Egyptian vacation. At least the Egyptians were pleased to see me when I arrived at the end of 332 BCE. They made me king of Egypt, and I made sure to respect their gods. I founded a city so the Greeks could trade with Egypt. Alexandria seemed like a fitting name. Traditional boats on the Nile River have not changed much since I traveled to Egypt. The best part of my stay in Egypt was going across the desert to the Siwa oasis. This was a very sacred place, and I spoke to the oracle of the god of Ammon. It was good news. The oracle said I was the son of Ammon, Egypt's top god, or the Greek version of Zeus. I'm not sure if I believed it myself, but it certainly helped to keep people on my side. Ancient Egypt. When Alexander arrived in Egypt, the Egyptian civilization along the Nile River was already 3,000 years old. Ancient Egypt had been invaded by Persia in around 520 BCE. The Persians had not been popular rulers, and Alexander was welcome. Hephaestion. Hephaestion was Alexander's closest friend throughout his life. He accompanied the king to Egypt and Asia, becoming commander of the cavalry. Alexander was deeply upset when his friend died in 324 BCE. Pursuing the Persians. I had a great time in Egypt, but after a few weeks of people being nice to me, I couldn't wait to get back on the battlefield. If we were going to finish off Darius, we would have to go deep into Asia, where no Greek or Macedonian army had ever been before. Showdown. Well, we went looking for a fight, and we found one. The Persian army waited for us deep inside their territory. We finally met at a battle of Gaugamela. The Persian army was much larger than ours, but we won a great victory. Darius, the so-called Great Persian king, once again ran for his life. Wimp. It took me a while to capture King Darius because he kept running away. With Darius hiding somewhere, I now ruled Persia. I then did something that none of my supporters expected. I put a Persian in charge of the city of Babylon. The Macedonians and Greeks thought I was getting soft. Parmenion. Parmenion had been Philip II's general. He took on the same job for Alexander, but he was much more cautious than the fiery young king. Parmenion was old enough to be Alexander's grandfather. Once the defeat of Darius was complete, Alexander no longer needed him. In 330 BCE, Alexander accused Parmenion's son of trying to kill him and had both father and son killed. Occasionally, my men argued against me, but I stayed in control for now. I will not demean myself by stealing victory like a thief. Alexander's reply when Parmenion advised him to attack Darius's forces at night. All work and no play. Winning battles was the easy part, apart from the danger of getting killed. After the defeat of Darius, I had to find ways to govern a huge empire, and that meant getting the Persians on my side. Otherwise, I'd have to deal with rebellions all the time. It was a great feeling when we reached the Persian capital of Persepolis. Then, I knew we'd really beaten them. It was the end of a long road, and I'm afraid we didn't behave very well. I now regret burning down the royal palace, but it showed who was boss. It was also revenge for Persian attacks on Greece in the past. Persepolis was a great city, but Greek and Macedonian soldiers were not in a friendly mood after years of fighting against the Persians. Still, there was no time to rest. I needed to make sure that Darius III was finally out of the way. He had fled to the far corner of the empire, so we followed. When we followed to his hiding place in Bactria, we found that some guy named Bessus had already murdered the king and was claiming the crown for himself. Documented. Those who wrote about him during his life had a favorable view of Alexander. If not, they might have found themselves in trouble. When looking at writing from the past, you should always think about whether the writer is giving a fair view or just giving one side of the argument. Think about this in your own writing too. Through the gift of the gods, I am now in possession of the country, and now that I am lord and master of all Asia, come to me. Alexander's letter to Darius III, 333 BCE. Finding new lands. The Persian Empire did not end in Persepolis. It had once stretched as far as the Indus River. When I told the army that we were heading farther east, they weren't happy. Every step we made was into new and unexplored land. It had been many years since the soldiers had seen their homes and families, and they were homesick. Uncovering plots. There were even plots to get rid of me, their glorious leader. I used one as an excuse to kill my father's old general, Parmenion, and his son. The army needed new blood in charge, so a bit of old blood had to be spilled. The high mountains of the Hindu Kush tested my army's strength and toughness. The first job was to teach Bessus a lesson. We followed him across the high mountains of the Hindu Kush. Finally, we caught up with Bessus. It was probably a bit harsh to cut off his nose and ears before killing him, but that was the Persian custom. Beyond the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire had once stretched as far as India, but the Persians had been pushed back by local leaders before Alexander arrived. Alexander faced fierce warriors whom he knew little about. These lands were all new to the Macedonians, and they also found natural hazards such as mountains, fast-flowing rivers, and barren deserts. Documented. Alexander was exploring new things at the time. New experiences are great topics to write about in a journal, even if it is something really normal like visiting a new city or discovering a new favorite band or movie. Alexander's empire in 323 BCE, Macedonia in 336 BCE, Alexander's campaigns 334 to 324 BCE, battles. My campaigns in Asia took me to lands where no European army had ever been before. Regrets. It is possible that all this success went to my head a little. Some of my army certainly thought so. One of my commanders, Cletus, claimed that I should be more humble and give some credit to my father for my success. I was angry, but maybe I shouldn't have killed him. I guess having the power to do absolutely anything you want is not necessarily a good thing. Remember, although I'd conquered half the world, I wasn't even 30 years old yet. One thing I learned in India was to keep clear of the ramping war elephants. Into India, but there was no time for moping around. India was waiting. There we faced the war elephants of the great warrior Porus at the Battle of the Hydaspes River. Although we won the battle, I was impressed by Porus and left him in charge of his lands. My plan was to keep going into the new lands, but my army let me down. They just refused to go any further. I was furious, but there wasn't much I could do. We built a fleet of ships on the Hydaspes River that carried us to the coast along other Indian rivers. From there we endured a terrible march back across the desert to Persia. No army could defeat me, but the hot, dry desert nearly finished off my troops. This silver medal was made to mark my victories in India. Nearchus. Nearchus traveled with Alexander from Greece. He was put in charge of a fleet of 150 ships that explored the coast of the Indian Ocean and carried part of the army to meet up with Alexander after his desert march. The end of the march. In 325 BCE, my campaigns were over, at least for now. The army was tired, and many of the soldiers were getting old. I also needed to start ruling rather than just adding new lands to my empire. The problem with conquering people is you make an awful lot of enemies. I always had to watch my back. I didn't know whom to trust. Peace was a lot more difficult than war. People often asked me what makes a great general. I believed it's important to listen to those around you, but once a decision is made, I always act ruthlessly. I had to kill some of my most trusted generals when they questioned my authority. Moaning Macedonians. I tried to get the Macedonians and Persians to mingle. Many of my closest companions married Persians, but most of the Macedonians were not convinced. In the end, I told my army to go home if they didn't like it. I was staying in Asia. Some of the soldiers brought a litter to carry the king, but he refused it and ordered that his horse be brought alongside. When next he was seen, he was mounted on the horse, and at this the whole army applauded wildly over and over again. Alexander was injured fighting in India, but he did not want to show any weakness to his army. I was a powerful leader and conquered many lands. Back to Babylon. When I reached the city of Babylon with its beautiful gardens, I didn't really believe my conquering days were over. After all, I was only 32 years old, still much too young to retire. Many of the greatest generals hadn't even started by my age. With a new, younger army, I could go back to explore India again. By 323 BCE, I had conquered a great empire and was ready to start ruling it. There would always be more places to explore and conquer, but there did not seem much point if it all fell apart when you died. I needed someone who could take over the empire from me. I had certainly come a long way from Macedonia, and there was still a lot to do. Alexander is shown on his deathbed. The great king certainly made lots of enemies who might have wanted to murder him. Was Alexander murdered? Alexander died in Babylon on June 11, 323 BCE. No one can be sure why. Alexander was incredibly fit and strong, but he could have caught an illness. Some experts think that Alexander was murdered like his father, possibly with poison. The murderer could have been one of his companions who bore a grudge or who feared that he might be dismissed or executed by the king. Roxanne. Roxanne married Alexander to seal an alliance between him and her family, who ruled lands in Central Asia. Roxanne was the mother of Alexander's son, who was born after the death of his father. Roxanne and young Alexander were both killed in the wars that followed the death of Alexander the Great. This picture was painted long after Alexander died. In fact, he never met his son, who was also named Alexander. Alexander's place in history. Many people saw Alexander as a god while he was still alive. More than 2,300 years after he died, it still seems incredible that, in a few short years, the young king could have conquered such a huge empire. But Alexander did not live long enough to test whether the empire could last, and so his work was left unfinished. We can only guess whether Alexander would have been able to hold his empire together. He certainly had a big impact on all those who followed him, as he built bridges between the civilizations of Europe and Asia. His military campaigns spread Greek culture across a huge area, and he founded more than 70 cities across the empire. But Alexander's main impact was probably his amazing strength and fighting spirit. He inspired many later generals from Julius Caesar to Napoleon to believe that they could match his success. I cannot determine with certainty what sort of plans Alexander had in mind, but none was small and petty, and he would not have stopped conquering even if he'd added Europe to Asia and the British Isles to Europe. Arrian, a Roman who wrote Alexander's biography 500 years after his death, 177 CE. Roman generals like Julius Caesar were inspired by Alexander as they built their own great empire. They also created many statues of Alexander. What happened to Alexander's empire? Alexander's empire was made up of Macedonians, Greeks, Egyptians, and many different peoples within the Persian Empire. They were only held together by Alexander's rule. After his death, the generals appointed Alexander's infant son and his half-brother Philip Aridius as joint kings. However, in a few years, both had been murdered, and Alexander's empire had separated into several different states.